Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Many of you know that I spent 40 years of my career working on pollution issues, mainly representing commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen, beginning on the Hudson River and then the Waterkeeper Alliance, which I co-founded, expanded to become the biggest water protection group in the world with 350 patrol boats on waterways in 46 countries, litigating against polluters. And a lot of the polluters that I was suing were from the carbon industry. People complain about climate, but the carbon industry is a dirty industry from cradle to grave. It cuts down the mountains of West Virginia. It's poisoned or sterilized thousands of miles of rivers and streams in our country. It has destroyed, acidified the lakes on the high peaks of the Adirondacks to where none of those high peaks lakes has fish in them anymore. It's acidifying the ocean. It causes mercury discharges, which have contaminated every freshwater fish in America, ozone and particulates and everything else. Most environmentalists today focus on climate, and climate is a real issue. And I've spent 40 years looking at that science, but what we've seen over the past couple of years is that issue has been captured, hijacked in many ways by the World Economic Forum and particularly by Bill Gates. And they're doing the same thing to us that the pharmaceutical industry does, which they aggravate the problem and then sell us the solution. And of course, the solution that they want for climate are more social controls, and then the big solution of geoengineering projects, which of course Bill Gates is funding all over the world. And today I want to talk about geoengineering, and particularly as it's related to climate, because it is a threat that the environmental community needs to know about, and the rest of us need to know about. It is a threat that is probably as dangerous to us as climate change itself. And that's why I've invited today to talk to us Dane Wigington, who is the producer of the groundbreaking climate engineering documentary film, The Dimming. Dane has a background in solar energy. He was a former employee of Bechtel and was a licensed contractor in California and Arizona. He's devoted the last 20 years of his life to in-depth research on the issue of covert global climate engineering operations and the effort to expose and to halt them. His personal residence was featured as a cover article in the world's largest renewable energy magazine, Home Power. He manages a wildlife preserve next to Lake Shasta in Northern California. Dana has appeared in numerous films and interviews in his effort to educate the public on the extremely dire environmental and health dangers that we face from the ongoing global climate intervention program. So welcome to the podcast, Dana. I'm so glad that you could join me.
It's a pleasure and an honor, Robert. And your description is very accurate and on target. And the paradox, the irony here is that we have a global power structure that thinks they can counter the damage already done by human activity, anthropogenic activity, which is in a sense a form of geoengineering because we're altering the planet's life support systems. And they are trying to sell us doing even more intervention as a form of a cure, much like you described, the pharmaceutical industrial complex mentality. And this is the climate engineering issue itself. What we would argue at geoengineeringwatch.org, that there can't be any legitimate discussion about climate or the state of the climate from any perspective without addressing this first and foremost. We would also argue that the state of the climate is even worse than we are being told, and climate engineering is further fueling that process, not mitigating it.
Okay, so let's start with one thing that a lot of people have heard about, and nobody really knows what to think about it, but chemtrails. Are chemtrails real? And, tell us about them.
Let's start with that. That's the appropriate place to start. What we're seeing in our skies are not condensation trails in almost all cases. They are sprayed particulate trails, and we're not speculating. We have up-close film footage of military tankers and commercial, nozzles visible, turning on and off. GeoEngineeringWatch.org, as a part of the film The Dimming, At great effort and expense, we acquired a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration flying lab, put top scientists in it, took samples at altitude behind heavy aircraft. We sampled what they were emitting. The sample was processed at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic University, one of the top testing institutions in the world. We found exactly what we knew we would find: climate engineering elements, starting with aluminum, which is named in one of the most significant climate engineering patents. And the climate engineers themselves have stated their goal of putting tens of millions of tons of aluminum nanoparticles into the atmosphere annually as part of solar radiation management to block some of the sun's incoming thermal energy with no consideration of the consequences whatsoever.
So, okay, that this is a classic conspiracy theory, right? Chemtrails. People who talk about chemtrails are regarded as tinfoil hats. So tell us, what proof do we have that chemtrails are happening and who is doing it? Because you see, I'm on a flight path coming into LAX and I see commercial aircraft with contrails coming out of their tails. So, and those aren't chemtrails. I assume. Are chemtrails, are they putting the aluminum particulates in commercial aircraft, or is this all military aircraft or civilian contractors? And what kind of evidence do we have that it's going on?
Unless you're seeing a plane landing with perhaps a wing vortex, which is certainly a benign phenomenon, or a fuel dump, if you're seeing an aircraft emitting a trail at altitude, even a commercial aircraft, the chances are almost certain that that is a sprayed dispersion or a fuel additive happening in that aircraft, which is also part of climate engineering operations. Again, we have up close film footage of these aircraft, including commercial, turning on and off at altitude. That means that cannot be a condensation trail. These are up close images: KC-10s, KC-135, C-17 Globemasters, and commercial aircraft. We have extremely up close photographic images of the retrofit nozzles mounted on the wing pylons of commercial aircraft aimed into the exhaust jet stream. We are not implicating commercial pilots. We are not implicating commercial personnel. They are not involved to our knowledge, but their aircraft in many cases are being used. If you remember when the big luggage situation came into play in the airlines around 2002, that suddenly it was a big concern how much luggage you carried on, how much weight there was, and so forth. And that is about the period in time when we feel the commercial industry was utilized more heavily for much lighter payloads than a military plane can carry. And certainly these are automated systems. So again, we're not implicating commercial pilots or personnel, although we are working with some that behind the scenes are leaving GeoEngineering Watch.org printed materials covertly in pilot lunchrooms and so forth. But again, as far as this not being condensation, let's look at another factor. All military tankers and all commercial aircraft are fitted with what's known as a high bypass turbofan jet engine. That's a jet-powered fan. 80% of the air that moves through that engine is not combusted. That engine by design is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances. And beyond all this, I would ask people to believe what they see with their own eyes. When you see an aircraft leaving a trail clear across the horizon that suddenly shuts off and it leaves nothing on the rest of its journey, or you see grid patterns in the sky one day and nothing the next with similar atmospheric patterns, of course, something is clearly wrong. And we see loops and aircraft making large configurations in X's and so forth that we believe is to mark the air current movement. But high bypass turbofan jet engine, by design, nearly incapable of making condensation trail, nozzles visible, film footage turning on and off. And one more thing, if I could add to this, Robert, you certainly have seen all the B-17 bombers in World War II leaving the massive trails behind them, correct?
Yeah.
So we captured off the military archives film footage of one B-17 flying in formation under another, filming these massive dispersions from that aircraft. And we got film capture of that being shut off instantaneously in air. That aircraft didn't fall. The aircraft all around it continued to disperse. That aircraft continued to fly in formation. Clearly, there was some sort of beta testing going on, which would make sense because we know these programs were initially deployed immediately after World War II over the polar regions, which would make sense as well, because those are the air conditioners of the planet. They knew the poles were beginning to melt, and that would be the logical place for them to start. And then by the 50s, we had Stanford acknowledging a, quote, Arctic haze that contained aluminum in the haze, and they couldn't figure out where that aluminum was coming from. So again, I could go on and on with various puzzle pieces, but we ask people to look at the data, not to believe what we say, and to consider, and I know this will hit home, close to home for you, given your family's background, which I so respect and revere. We have President Lyndon Johnson on film, on the record, when he was vice president in 62, stating that we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then, 60 years ago, and quote, "He who controls the weather controls the world." On film, on the record. That's the lead in 30 seconds to every weekly GeoEngineering Watch commercial-free global alert news broadcast, which is on 16 stations around the country. So maybe you've seen that, but for those listeners that haven't, I would encourage them to watch that.
And it would seem that there would be thousands of pilots and thousands of people who would have to be aware of this program and be participating in it. How come we don't see more whistleblowers coming out, particularly people who are retired?
Excellent question. And again, I would first start with this. We could ask Julian Assange what happens with whistleblowers. Next, I would add that we have right now an illegal commercial gag order on all the nation's weathermen, National Weather Service and NOAA. And that is a massive red flag. Why in the world would our government feel the need to gag the weathermen? Next, we have massive compartmentalization. We know in Vietnam, for example, did the pilot flying the aircraft spraying Agent Orange on the ground, which eventually killed many U.S. soldiers, as you know, was he told that that would kill his partner on the ground? Of course not. So it's massive compartmentalization. And those that do know, we would argue, are being told they're doing something benevolent. If it's military personnel, they're certainly being told they're doing something benevolent for the greater good. And now let's add this. We know, according to the Washington Post, as far back as 1977, the Washington Post recorded that there had been no less than 239 open-air biological tests conducted on the U.S. population by the U.S. military without their knowledge or their consent. So again, there are so many factors that connect to this. And finally, given the severity of what we face, and I would argue we don't face global warming, we face something far worse. We face what would be scientifically termed an abrupt climate collapse. There are so many feedback mechanisms now that have been triggered, like the methane release happening in the Arctic, and the acceleration of those events is so severe that I think it would be very naive for our population to believe that governments around the globe wouldn't engage in these operations without public knowledge or consent. And a final factor, we have a U.S. Senate document 800 pages long that outlines global cooperation between major governments, major superpowers. Even if they have, quote, otherwise adversarial relations, they will cooperate in the climate engineering operations, because you can't just climate engineer over one country without affecting the entire world. Within that document, there is a provision for total legal immunity for anyone and everyone involved.
And is it mainly, I mean, the frightening thing about this is I know that there's been many tests now that are showing accumulations of aluminum, even in places in very remote parts of the earth, in the soils. And it's hard to explain why that would happen. And people should know this, that aluminum was never a free molecule prior to the World War II era. Aluminum, all the aluminum on Earth is bound into silicate. And so it wasn't like there are many other metals like iron, et cetera, that are in the seawater and zinc and magnesium, et cetera, that are free and biologically available. But aluminum was really not biologically available prior to World War II, and particularly the airline industry, when aluminum smelting became very widespread. And then, of course, the aluminum got into our cookware, it got into aluminum cans, it got into food storage, et cetera. And we now know that aluminum gets stored in the brain, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, it has a high association with Alzheimer's and with many other brain injuries and other injuries. And so it's kind of frightening to think that somebody may be putting large amounts of bioavailable aluminum into the environment, spraying it in microscopic particulates from airplanes.
You're completely correct on every point. Thank you for bringing that point up, that aluminum does not exist naturally in the environment in free form, always bonded to other elements. And we now have lab tests from around the world, all of which contain some level of aluminum. That's what brought me into this fight. When I began to lose massive amounts of my solar power uptake, I spent my whole life trying to get out of the smoggy Southern California, moved to the Pacific Northwest, built this off-grid home, and was losing huge amounts of my solar power uptake from whatever these aircraft were emitting, which I knew could not be condensation, not to block 70 or 80% of my solar PV uptake on some days. And that doesn't mean there's an 80% reduction in overall light. It just means you have to have direct sunlight for solar panels to function. I began to test my precipitation, did not want to find that primary element of aluminum, but I did. I continued to test my precipitation. In the course of 18 months, the amount of aluminum in a single precipitation event went from 7 ppb, parts per billion, to 3,450 ppb in a single rain event. That's highly toxic rain. So much aluminum is falling in our region of Northern California. It has altered soil pH values from 10 to 12 times toward alkaline. Rain pH should be about 5.6 based on atmospheric carbon loading. We're seeing now 6.6, 6.8 in some cases. We're testing individual precipitation events. The precipitation that is very high in aluminum, it's actually pushing the pH value toward neutral. And in regard to where else that might be coming from, because that's a question people ask. Maybe there's some industry across the street from me or so forth. We know from CARB, California Air Resources Board, that when they're testing from the aerosols from China, because there's nothing between, China, Japan, Asia, there's nothing between us and them. And CARB studies do not show aluminum migrating across the ocean. Mercury can, of course, because it converts to a gaseous state, but not aluminum. So where is that much metal coming from? And a final note, your viewers, your followers, can watch the world's most recognized geoengineer, Dr. David Keith, who works for Mr. Gates, works with Mr. Gates, works for Harvard as well, world's most recognized geoengineer at an international geoengineering conference, presenting his proposal, this was in 2010, to put 10 to 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticles into the atmosphere annually. And on film, on the same footage, which is on the Dimming documentary, I confronted Dr. Keith at that presentation, at that conference, asking him, had any toxicological studies been done whatsoever on these particles? His first response was, well, we studied the amount of atmospheric aerosol particulate loading. Paraphrase, there's a lot of material or a lot of particles up there, a few more won't hurt. And before they cut me off, I followed up with, those particles aren't aluminum. Have you studied aluminum? And what the world's most recognized geoengineers said, no, could terrible things happen tomorrow? We don't know. They banned me from the subsequent conferences for asking that question.
Yeah, I mean, the ironic thing about Gates is that Gates has, and I've documented this in my book and in a bunch of articles, he has these vast investments in carbon industries, in the coal industry, in most of the big oil companies. He had when I was, when I last researched this, and I'm not sure it's still true, but I know there's no reason to believe that it isn't, but he owned manufacturing facilities for private airplanes or maintenance facilities for he had a private airplane company. He owns a big stake in the railroads, and I think about 20% of rail, and I could be wrong about this, but it's going to be close. About 20% of railroad revenues, I think, come from carrying coal. And so he has a portfolio that is very, very heavily carbon. Of course, he flies private everywhere, and he's to Davos, as they all do. So he doesn't seem particularly concerned about global warming. And I was in the environmental movement for 40 years. I didn't work directly on climate because I mainly focused on pollution issues, which are related because they're coming from the same factories, and for the same power plants and cement kilns, et cetera. I was working for organizations like NRDC, which were very heavily involved in climate. And Gates never contributed to these organizations. He was not contributing to climate advocacy like maybe, some of the other, like Ted Turner and Bloomberg and the other people who talk about climate a lot. They were giving money to people who were advocating for laws to end subsidies to the carbon industry and these kind of things. But Gates really was never involved in doing those things. So his involvement in, then he goes ahead and writes a book on climate this year, and he starts pretending that he's a big climate activist, but he's never been involved in climate activism. The only thing that he's been involved in is, as far as I know, is funding these big geoengineering projects that seem just insane. And, my whole life I've been, a lot of what I do is fighting people who are trying to impose engineering solutions on environmental problems. God designed the planet to work pretty well. And usually trying to fix it with an engineering solution is like whack-a-mole. It just causes more problems down the line. And if you're going to do a big, large-scale engineering solution, dams, dikes, lakes, etc., you better look at all of the unanticipated results of that. And it doesn't seem that they do that again. And he does the same thing with vaccines. He's giving vaccines loaded with aluminum and mercury to 161 million kids in Africa. And if you ask him what happens to they put the mercury and the aluminum in the vaccines to promote an antibody response. But if you say to him, okay, well, those toxins did a good job of inducing an antibody response, what happens to the toxin afterwards? What is the fate in the human body? Does it go into the brain? Is it excreted? Does it go into the hair, the fingernails, the urine, the feces? What happens to it? And he can't answer that question. They're not thinking about it. All they're thinking is, we have a problem. Here's an engineering solution. Don't ask me about any of the collateral damage from that solution. And that, it seems insane that somebody would sprinkle aluminum dust into the atmosphere, which we know is deadly toxic to the human brain.
Exactly what the world's most recognized geoengineer and Dr. David Key said at this conference. The premise for him pushing aluminum as the element of choice is because it has a high albedo, high reflectivity, and low coagulation rate. And again, with no consideration of the consequences. We have lab tests from all over the globe, aluminum in all of them, in addition to barium, strontium, manganese, polymer fibers. The last 100 plus tests contained graphene. The tests contain surfactants, which we know from what we believe to be the primary material supplier, American Elements Institute. The surfactants are used to keep the nanoparticles from coagulating before they're dispersed. We see foaming rain everywhere. That's indicative of surfactants in the mix. We've tested frozen precipitation. It is packed with surfactants, which would be one reason why the snow is especially slippery now. In regard to the aluminum and the dispersions over the oceans, we believe that solar radiation management operations, stratospheric aerosol injection, and most of these operations are taking place in the troposphere, not the stratosphere. But we
explain that. How high is the troposphere? The stratosphere. Well, go ahead.
Depends entirely on location. Stratosphere in the polar regions can be as low as 23,000 feet, which means they can definitely spray in the stratosphere over the polar regions. Even some of the lower latitudes can be as low as 33,000 feet. So some of these operations are taking place in the stratosphere where the stratosphere is at lower elevations. But what we believe is also occurring over the oceans is a dual purpose.
And the troposphere is where? It's lower altitudes?
Generally, at the mid-latitudes, it would be high 30,000s in that range. And again, it depends on location on the planet. Depends on their atmospheric conditions can vary as well. But most aircraft fly in the upper troposphere, and that's where we're seeing dispersions. But we're seeing dispersions even at mid-latitudes as low as 20,000 feet. That's low. These particles don't stay aloft long. The lower the altitude, the larger the payload the aircraft can carry, and that may be one of their considerations. At lower altitudes, a KC-135 can carry 100 tons of material in a single payload. These are astoundingly high numbers of this particulate, and it would correlate to what we're seeing in the soil pH changes. And back to ocean iron fertilization, that's another proposal for geoengineering to fertilize the oceans, to force them to uptake more CO2. And we would argue this has already been occurring for decades, that the SRM, solar radiation management dispersions that are happening over our oceans, are also part of ocean iron fertilization. And that would correlate with studies we have, peer-reviewed studies of, for example, whales that are packed with alarming levels of aluminum. And as you stated, with all these organisms, aluminum toxic to virtually all life forms, no exception. And we see marine mammals like whales with peer-reviewed study that are packed full of aluminum. We have science study advocating for polymer-coated aluminum particles to be used in ocean iron fertilization. So again, there are so many puzzle pieces that connect. And clearly,
when you say the whales, because I've seen studies of beluga whales in the mouth of the St. Lawrence that are packed with aluminum. I mean, the highest aluminum levels ever found in living organisms in those whales. But that's because there's aluminum smelters, presumably, all along the St. Lawrence, those Canadian aluminum smelters that are operating on Canadian hydropower. Aluminum, as you know, to separate the aluminum from the bauxite, which is where geologically it occurs, you need tremendous heat, and it's very expensive to smelt. And so the places like Iceland and Canada that have a lot of hydropower are are the location of choice for the aluminum smelters. You have cheap power. And so there's a lot of aluminum in the beluga whales there, but are you saying there's whales in the ocean that have high aluminum levels?
Yes, with peer-reviewed science study. There are no smelters in my region of Northern California. Lake Shasta is in my backyard, along with the upper Sacramento River. I have been invited and included in closed-door meetings with Redding Environmental Health, that's the city furthest north in California, shown the lab tests for the massive spikes of aluminum in the rivers. This is the drinking water for California. Massive spikes in aluminum after every storm event. They didn't know where this metal was coming from. They've never disclosed these tests to date. So again, the level of cover up here is beyond comprehension. And I've had private meetings in the Capitol with Governor Gavin Newsom, who knows this is going on, won't say anything. All the environmental groups you mentioned, all of them, WWF, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, Earth Justice, all of them. Our attorneys at geoengineeringwatch.org have spoken to their attorneys about this issue. They will not bring this issue up in any of their organizations because they don't want to lose their 501c3 nonprofit. We find that to be unimaginably hypocritical because the data to back this up is absolutely monumental.
I got to push back on that because I know these environmental leaders and I know their environmental groups, and nobody's worried about losing their 501c3 by taking a tough stand on an issue. There may be other reasons why they're not doing it. That would not be a reason. They're not going to lose a 501c3 by criticizing the United States government. They can't do that to you. But there may be other reasons. There's reasons that there's reasons they don't go after the pharmaceutical industry. Even the environmental groups that are, working on toxins and toxins to children have kind of a blind eye to the chronic disease epidemic and what's happening to our kids. And they don't want to do it because it's unpopular in a particular tribe or with political leaders. But I can't imagine, I think that probably the reason they don't want to do it is that it's regarded as a crazy person's issue. It's regarded and I don't think of it that way, but it's easy, as it's people, you take a lot of strength to do what you're doing. You're obviously very well informed. You've researched this stuff very well. I'm persuaded by what you're saying, but you must have had the experience of people dismissing this issue as something that just is too crazy to even contemplate. And I think the environmental groups are very wary to get involved. That's why they won't get involved with vaccines. They feel they'll be marginalized if they get in. They only half believe it. They only half believe that it's happening.
I can only convey what our attorneys have told us that their attorneys told them. So again, if there's other reasons, and I can't know what their ultimate motivation is, but that's what we've been told. They won't even look at this issue. And I would ask this: how preposterous is it when we have the entire climate science community all over the globe describing exactly what we see in our skies as something we need to do immediately to deploy stratospheric aerosol injection, solar radiation management, jet aircraft spraying particles into the sky to block some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. And we have film footage of exactly this happening with literally whole horizons covered from what jet aircraft emit. This is time-lapse film footage. We have the exact elements named in multiple climate engineering patents. We have about 150 listed at geoengineeringwatch.org. Those same elements showing up in absolutely alarming quantities on the ground. We have a condition now called global dimming, which is the amount of direct sunlight no longer reaching the surface of the planet that's staggeringly high. We have also global stilling, another science term, which means the overall wind flow around the planet is being diminished. We have a radical reduction in overall precipitation around the globe. Yes, we have deluge in many places, but overall we have much more protracted drought. The laws of physics say that can't happen on a rapidly warming planet because the atmosphere holds 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. We believe from frontline temperatures that we are past 3.5 degrees C right now, not 1.5, 3.5. And so how can we have that reduction in the hydrological cycle, that level of global dimming, the reduction of wind flow, which would be related to a interference with convection on the planet? All of those dots connect to what we know climate engineering consequences to be. And there's one more big one that's very alarming. We are seeing extraordinarily high levels of UVC on the surface, not just extreme levels of UVB. We are detecting UVC. We have a former NASA contract engineer that works directly for geoengineeringwatch.org with equipment we supplied him, state-of-the-art equipment. And we are told UVC stops 100,000 feet up in the atmosphere. Peer-reviewed study 6 months ago from a group of scientists acknowledged the UVC on the surface, and they were attacked immediately. And that study was swept under the rug. We're seeing other evidence of that. We're seeing bark scorch on the Cambrian layer of trees from tip to trunk. We're seeing plankton population decline off the scale. And we know plankton feed in the upper layers of the water column, so the UVC would certainly wreak havoc with their populations. Recent peer-reviewed study shows in the Atlantic a 90% decline in plankton. Peer-reviewed study. We see the evidence of everything we would expect with climate engineering, including the elements on the ground. And yet we're told that this is some sort of fringe issue when every single government in the globe is discussing it, every single climate scientist is discussing it, and we have a history of weather modification going back 75 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'll push back on the hydrological cycle because what the most of the modeling suggests that I've been reading for 40 years is that you're going to get a lot more rainfall in coastal regions, but because of the heat, the excess heat in interiors of the continents, it's going to get much drier. That obviously, if you've got a hotter atmosphere, you're going to have more evaporation, more precipitation, and the question is, where does that precipitation ring out of the clouds? Does it do it in between the coast and the coastal ranges, or does it make it into the interior of the country? But all of the issues that you're talking about make sense.
I think we actually agree on that point, though.
What?
I think we do agree on the drought situation. We're not saying that with a rapidly warming planet you wouldn't have these drought-prone areas in interior regions. What we're speaking about is overall precipitation, and overall global precipitation is down, not up. And again, laws of physics make clear 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. And we know with the type of ocean fertilization programs that we believe are being conducted, if there's polymer fibers in that, and there's been polymer fibers in our precipitation testing here, that would certainly inhibit evaporation over the oceans. The blocking of direct sunlight absolutely inhibits evaporation.
Is the polymer fiber, is that another particulate that they use to block the energy of the sun?
It's in the patents, yes, and even mentioned in David Keith's presentation, the polymer fibers being used as a means to keep the particles aloft longer, just like a spider web does for those types of spiders that migrate in the atmosphere. That is the thinking behind the use of polymer fibers.
Dane, let me ask you one thing. Who owns the patents? Are they big, like military contractors, or?
U.S. government owns many of the primary ones. The patent holder is signed to U.S. government. Raytheon holds many. Lockheed Martin holds many. And by the way, to tie those two private defense contractors into this scenario, we know that Lockheed Martin and Raytheon do all the weather modeling for the nation's weathermen that have a federal gag order on them. Lockheed Martin are neck deep in climate engineering patents and climate engineering operations. So We have the foxes literally running the hen house for the quote scheduled weather. And that's how, even down to the local meteorologist level, we have them predicting a quote mostly sunny day a week in advance here, for example, in Northern California. And on that day, there's not a natural cloud in the sky. There's only sprayed aerosol dispersions. How did that meteorologist know 7 days in advance that that was going to occur? So again, we know that they're doing the weather modeling for National Weather Service and NOAA. In fact, that has to be because they need to control the narrative. And that's exactly what they're doing.
Okay, two questions. One is, you say that all of the weathermen, are you talking about the television weathermen are under a gag order? Because this seems crazy too.
No. National Weather Service and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Okay, so they're under a gag order. Do we know what the gag order says?
It's a general gag order. It was sent to us in the mail in an unmarked envelope when it was first issued. But it's a general gag order that restricts them from discussing any of the organization's conduct or operations. It's a very...
Does it mention geoengineering?
No. It restricts them from discussing anything about the organization's operations. And as far as getting down to a local meteorologist level, certainly that's a matter of protecting paychecks and pensions. They know how long their leash is. I think we see the same, Robert, in the CV-19 scenario and everything involved with it.
Well, there's no reason a local TV weatherman would know anything about this anyway. I mean, I don't think they need to be read into the program because they aren't part of it. They wouldn't know. But again, I want to go back to this other issue that I talked to you about that I still don't know. But is it your theory or that a lot of this is happening from the commercial aircraft that we ride on? You know, if I have to go to New York or something, is it possible that airline for American Airlines is spraying this stuff and the pilot doesn't know about it?
Two potential scenarios there. I'll answer that in a moment. I just want to back up to local meteorologists. We're not at all implying that they're part of it being included in any of these operations as far as in the know. We're simply stating that they certainly know they're reading scripts. They are definitely reading scripts. They put out the same narrative. We see them change that narrative at the same time as the weather bounces all over the board because these programs do exactly what you described earlier, weather whack-a-mole. So we're not implying with them or the commercial pilots and personnel, they're not involved, but certainly they know. We're communicating with some commercial pilots and personnel. So just trying to separate that out. And on the rest, I'm sorry, Robert, your question you just asked me was...
I was asking about, because, I was a pilot for a while, and even when, not on a commercial aircraft, but if you're a pilot, even on a big commercial aircraft, you walk around your airplane and you make sure that you understand everything that's going on in there and what's being loaded on and what's not. And
clear with that.
My question is, if I'm flying on an American Airlines flight from LA to New York, is it possible that flight, do you believe that flight may be part of this program?
Completely recall. I'm sorry, I dropped the ball on that for a moment. Two scenarios, as I stated a moment ago. We know that the US DoD is leasing no less than 400 commercial aircraft with commercial markings. Why would they need 400 commercial aircraft with commercial markings? Next, again, as far as what commercial pilots know, and we're communicating with them, so we know that they know, but they're not saying anything about this. And just like we have how many in the medical industry who must know, we're talking about trained physicians who must know that aluminum and mercury are neurotoxins. They have to be harmful. And yet all of them pretending they're, quote, safe and effective. And I would argue the exact same scenario applies here. So when we have the US military leasing 400 commercial aircraft or more with commercial markings, we have a much smaller payload carried with a commercial aircraft. It may be as low as 5% as a military tanker fully loaded, but we know that they're dispersing because we have up close images of them doing so, turning on and off. And you don't hit that kind of vertical layering in the atmosphere. It's layered horizontally. So you're not going to have a trail that cuts off like it was cut with a knife. That's not possible atmospherically. So again, yes, commercial aircraft are being used. We can't know if the particular aircraft with the particular commercial markings is necessarily carrying passengers or not, but the U.S. military leasing many of those aircraft. Next, the U.S. military tanker fleet. We have the U.S. military owns and controls 3 times more aerial tankers than all other militaries in the world combined. If I can add one more historical fact into this, I think would have relevance for everybody given global events. We have, for example, after 9/11, we had General Wesley Clark stating on the record that the Middle Eastern countries that were to be targeted, a list that we believe existed before 9/11 even occurred. But my point is this, that those Middle Eastern countries, every single one subsequently underwent a once in 1,000-year drought. That's mathematically, statistically impossible to have that kind of coincidence unless there was something else in the equation. That's something else we would argue is climate engineering. And to back that up, we have leaders of some of those countries, in the case of Iran, on the floor of the United Nations stating emphatically that NATO was cutting off their precipitation, destabilizing food production, thus destabilizing populations. We know that Iran's a target of NATO. It has been for a very long time. Next, if we look at the satellite imagery off of the California coast, for example, we can see these operations occurring. We're not guessing or speculating. We can see them completely breaking up the storm track. And I would encourage you listeners to view presentations that I did up to a decade or more ago, Engineered Drought Catastrophe Target California, a decade ago. Every single thing I said would happen here has happened. Not because I was looking into a crystal ball, but because I was looking at data. And if these programs continued, it had to happen, and it did.
Yeah, I'll tell you one of the reasons that I kind of take this, my mind is open to this, is because Woody Harrelson one time was at my house and he was talking about this. This was probably 10 years ago. And I was saying, come on, that's ridiculous. That's impossible. And he said, come outside with me. And we went outside and we sat on a hillside and we watched these planes fly in a grid pattern, laying out this, a grid of contrails, and then it turned into clouds and we had a cloudy day. And I don't know, I've looked up many times since then and seen that happening. And I don't have a good explanation for it. But, the things that you're saying are consistent, are internally consistent, and they're consistent with things that I've observed. It's amazing to think that they can keep it that secret that well for this long. But, I've seen them do that with other things as well. Many other things,
again,
by the way.
Yeah, I would. Your specialty and what you've been so heroic at championing this cause of what's being done in the medical industry, and I would cite that again as an example. How can the entire medical industry not recognize and acknowledge that injecting aluminum and mercury into a system is going to do harm, and in addition to the current scenario that we have, and yet we have the vast majority of that community pretending that it's okay, that it's not doing harm. And I would argue the same is true here. So we have to stand back and understand, given the severity of biosphere collapse, and based on the statistical mathematical trajectory, if we continue on this course, none of us are going to be here that much longer. We have global wildlife populations crashing right now, that we've lost 70% of global wildlife populations in the last 40 years. Some sites citing 50.
Yeah, but there's a lot of other reasons that's happening too.
Certainly. I'm not blaming. I'm not. No. I'm not.
I mean, the thing that to me that is really, I'm not going to say dispositive, but really hard to explain, is that I've seen all of this data about the aluminum concentrations dramatically increasing in national forest lands and other places that are completely remote from any smelter. And as you say, aluminum, unlike mercury, precipitates out of the atmosphere within 100 to 200 miles from a smelter. Oh, if you're on the West Coast and the nearest smelter is in, upwind smelter is in Japan or China, the aluminum, there's no explanation for all that aluminum, those aluminum concentrations in national forests on the West Coast. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't. If I could just back up for the record, I definitely did not mean to imply in any way that what's happening could be blamed entirely on climate engineering. Not at all. We've been unimaginably poor stewards of the planet. I mean, where would we start? I lectured on global warming before I focused all on climate engineering. So, I mean, yeah, we're poisoning the oceans, we're cutting down our forests, we're paving the planet, dumping nuclear waste everywhere. So I certainly recognize all of that. I'm just simply stating as an aggregate that given the severity of our situation, given the severity of climate collapse, why would we think that governments around the globe wouldn't deploy this in a last-ditch effort to keep business as usual until the last possible moment? And I would argue that's exactly what they're doing. And even if I could, before I get I forget to include this. A key part of climate engineering is engineering winter weather events. And that's key right now because we have Winter Storm Elliott being manipulated in the US. In regard to the validity of that manipulation, the climate engineers being able to seed endothermic reacting elements, energy absorbing elements into clouds to create a cold dense layer that descends to the surface and create frozen precipitation out of what would have been liquid precipitation. I would cite, if your listeners search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm, they'll find Popular Science covered it, Fox News, MSNBC, and everybody else. They did $2 billion worth of damage to Beijing by nucleating clouds into frozen precipitation. They stopped talking about it after that. We have the patents for this. We've tested the frozen precipitation. And again, we have snow falling in places at 40 degrees. How does that happen? We have patents that based on elements like ammonium, barium, urea, stating that those patents can nucleate cloud moisture at temperatures 40 and 45 degrees. All of these dots connect when they do this, and they create a flash cold event. It serves the carbon industry very, very well because they can come up with lots of new records or cold temperatures. It skews public perception as to the true state of the warming on the planet. It confuses them, divides them, and again, creates a lot of low temperatures that skew the global data for the year, which keeps us from having record high months and years when we otherwise would have. So there are so many complexities here around climate engineering that serve those in power to keep business as usual until the last possible moment.
I think one of the other parts of your story that is important to understand is the military programs to weaponize climate, because of course they're doing that. Of course, I know they're doing that because they do it with everything else. They do it with chemicals, they do it with biology. Anything that they can weaponize, they're going to. And what you just said about Iran, and that if you're involving civilians in that program, in a program that is attached to the weaponization of climate, or the weaponization of weather, you can maybe force them to sign state secrecy contracts and everything else to make sure that, and of course, if you violate a state secret, there's a million Americans who, according to Kevin Shipp, who was running that program for the CIA, who have signed state secrecy agreements. So if you're involved with the civilian application of these geoengineering projects, and if they're being run by the Department of Defense, and they come to you and say, or the intelligence agencies, and they say, we want you to be part of this, but you need to sign a state secrecy agreement. Then you're never going to talk about it, because then you go to jail for 20 years and you lose every possession you have, and you don't get a lawyer either. So anyway, I think that's an aspect that makes the secrecy explainable. The fact that they are probably militarizing this and weaponizing it to attack other countries, to hurt other countries, crop production, et cetera.
I would fully agree. And Kevin's an exceptional human being. I know Kevin, he's a personal friend as well. And he's certainly spoken on this issue in the film, The Dimming. And this plugs into one of your earlier questions too, Robert. Those that have stepped forward that are retired. In our groundbreaking documentary, The Dimming, there are 2 U.S. Air Force generals, a brigadier general and a 2-star general, both acknowledging this issue on film, on the record. Former Canadian Minister of Defense acknowledging this issue on the record. Former PM for British Columbia, Canadian Premier for British Columbia, the same. We have former Forest Service scientists, former Fish and Game scientists, all in that film acknowledging this issue on the record. So there are some courageous individuals out there, and we simply are trying to get others to step forward. And I've been in the field with USDA scientists that I know testing forest floor pHs, and we have the baseline values, by the way. I want to make that clear. I have the original USDA baseline values in my possession, so we know how much they've escalated. But I've had these USDA scientists in the field looking at me very sheepishly. They know this is going on and saying, what do you want us to do about it? They don't want to jeopardize their employment, and they're not saying a thing.
All right. Well, give me some advice here. If for people who are listening to this podcast and they have questions and really want to figure out whether this is going on, where can they see this happening? What should they look for in their own lives and their own, as they would sort of walk around, what kind of signs of this should they look for? And then I'm going to ask you, if people have questions about this, where should they go to get good information?
First, about science, and there's a few major issues that we don't even see the agricultural industry acknowledging. One, we know bioavailable aluminum is toxic to root systems. We have peer-reviewed science study to confirm that. So it not only kills soil microbiome, but root systems, for example, in trees and forests, sense the toxin, they shut down nutrient uptake, they start to die a slow, protracted death, and we have the so-called experts in governmental agencies telling us it's just the beetles. Beetles are simply a symptom of a tree that's sick and dying. And we have aquatic and terrestrial insect life completely crashing. Geoengineering Watch acknowledged that in 2012, that insect populations were collapsing. The climate science or the science community tried to marginalize us for that. Now they're admitting to it. We have another condition. For those that are trying to grow gardens, to answer your question, their production is likely falling very rapidly. In addition to the soils being compromised, soil microbiome being harmed, soil pH values being affected, we have a condition called VPD, vapor pressure deficit. These particles, depending on what they're dispersing, are desiccants. So it's reducing atmospheric RH, relative humidity. This may be one of their goals because water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. They may be trying to reduce atmospheric RH in their myopic attempt to slow the visible signs of the warming. But what VPD does, if there's not enough humidity, the organism, be it trees, other types of flora, vegetables, they shut down their stomata, their respiratory ports. They stop breathing. Forests do not smell like forest anymore because the trees are not respirating. They're not absorbing carbon. They're not releasing oxygen. Now we know that forests, even like the Amazon, are not carbon sinks anymore. They're carbon sources. Same with boreal forests. VPD is a massive factor in this equation related to climate engineering, and no one's acknowledging that. So again, less plant growth, plant dying, the effects of the UV radiation, which can cause leaf scorch and bark scorch. There's many, many signs of this. And we're simply asking, Robert, for people to investigate. We don't ask anybody to believe anything we say. We're saying, look at the film footage, look at the governmental documents, look at the patents, listen to the testimony of former Air Force generals and so forth. And we're just asking them to look at the data, and starting with the Dimming documentary is a great place to start.
Dane Wigington, thank you so much for your activism. Thanks for your integrity and your courage. And thanks for joining us today on the podcast.
It's a pleasure and an honor. And thank you for giving a voice to this issue and encouraging those that follow you and all your courageous work to investigate this as well.
Dana, how can our listeners support you?
Just simply help to share our data and get us past social media censorship. GeoEngineeringWatch.org is non-political. We don't advertise. Our only goal is to bring this issue to the full light of day. The public has a right to know.
What's the name of the organization again?
GeoEngineeringWatch.org. It's important to put the watch part on because otherwise you go to a pro geoengineering website. So it's letters GEO, the word engineeringwatch.org.
Dana Wigington, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for your courage, your integrity, for your activism, and thanks for trying to wake us all up.
Thank you, Robert.